Now from Studio D, this is Talk of Alabama.
We begin at the heart of the Birmingham Campaign at Kelly Ingram Park. Celebrity historian Raffi Andonian showed us how the events in the Magic City influenced national policy. Take a look. Raffi, we're here at Kelly Ingram Park, a very significant place for Birmingham, but the civil rights movement. So tell us how this area fits into the heart of the civil rights movement.
This area is one of the most significant nationally. That's why there's a national monument, the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, that's dedicated to this area, including the park, the church behind us, the Gaston Motel nearby, and other sites that are all a part of this. And the reason it's so important is because it's central in 1963 to what's known as the Birmingham Campaign, which is an effort by Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth, which was local to Birmingham. Of course, the airport, Shuttlesworth Airport, is named after Shuttlesworth, who lead a campaign in the spring of 1963 to make Birmingham the epicenter of the fight against segregation in 1963. That's why this general area is so important, with each site having different contributions to that story.
Certainly. And throughout the park, there are monuments to really help us visualize the significance of these marches, these meetings, and that Kelly Ingram Park was a meeting place. It was an assembly place during the movement, too. So what does some of these monuments signify?
Well, not only was a park a meeting place, you're absolutely right, but I would add in addition to that, there were multiple attempts to do marches here during the Birmingham Campaign that were stopped right here at the park. So it's also significant in that it was often a point of resistance and often a point where the law enforcement said you cannot keep going further. So it's a point of also peaceful confrontation as well, much like you might think of, say, maybe not like Selma to Montgomery, you know, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is also near here, right? So these areas where you have peaceful protesters, although violence does break out with confrontations with law enforcement, of course, famously with dogs and fire hoses and things like that. But that's part of the reason this park itself is so important. So the monuments are dedicated to commemorating those moments. One of those moments, of course, was with Martin Luther King when he comes here. He was nearby Montgomery, of course, getting started out. He's originally from Atlanta, spent a lot of time in Birmingham. Part of the Birmingham Campaign is a teaming up, if you will, of Shuttlesworth and Martin Luther King, and I can get more into that as well. But that's why you have a monument to MLK right here in this park. And of course, you have the monument that's behind us to the 4 little girls that were killed in that church, the 16th Street Baptist Church, on a bombing in September of 1963 after the Birmingham Campaign was over, but was still part of the aftermath of the Birmingham Campaign because there was a lot of violence to show a reaction to what had taken place. They were bombing not only at the church to kill that ended up killing these 4 little girls on Sunday school, which was really a terrible moment, and that is really important nationally as well. But also, there was a bombing at the Gaston Motel in MLK's room. Now, he had just left at that point, so he was not there. There was also a bombing of MLK's brother's home, which is here nearby as well, because he had a church nearby Birmingham here as well. So these were all symbols of, in fact, Birmingham became known as Bombingham in the 50s and 60s because there were so many bombings. These are all symbols of a reaction to the campaign that had taken place. And that's why you have some of the monumentation that takes place right here. Now, the reason that those things are so significant nationally, looking back on it, the bombing of the girls with the KKK members, it was KKK members that did this particular bombing of the church that killed the 4 little girls. And 2 months later, JFK getting killed in November of 1963 was part of this national horrified sort of moment, emotional moment, that led to the push to the 1964 Civil Rights Act that took place, that is still to this day in effect, still to this day sometimes debated, components of it debated in the Supreme Court and in the rhetoric, and that happens because of the Birmingham Campaign.
On this Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we are looking at how events in Birmingham played a role in national policy. Take a look.
The fight, specifically the Birmingham Campaign in spring of 1963 in April and May, was an attempt to bring up, I should say, in the process, they were not afraid to use children. Now, that doesn't mean they put people, to be clear, that doesn't mean they wanted girls to get bombed, okay? So let's make that clear. But in the movement, in the months prior to this bombing that we're talking about, in the spring, because of the series of marches that are taking place, there's attempts to register to vote at courts. There are sit-ins that are taking place in both churches as well as lunch counters. But we forget the churches ones sometimes, actually. There's something they call kneel-ins. They would go to segregated white churches who are supposed to let in anyone that shows up at the door, and maybe that wouldn't always happen. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it didn't, right? Sometimes they were welcome, but sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were segregated, sometimes they were blocked away, sometimes they were met with violence. That was to highlight these issues, right? So my point with that is that with all the resistance that took place there and with law enforcement right here in this park, in one of the waves of protest, both MLK and Shuttlesworth decide that we can bring in children because of the moral power and the innocence of children to help lead these protests. And there is a moment in the spring of 1963 where they actually do that. They have children protesting. And when the violence against children breaks out, that really grosses out, if you will, much of the nation watching. And that's the impact of having MLK here. Because one thing to point out is someone like a Shuttlesworth, locally, of course, very important, led a church here in Birmingham. Shuttlesworth was leading a local campaign, among other folks, for years prior to the Birmingham campaign. And that's something we forget about, whether we're talking about Birmingham or Montgomery or Selma or parts of Mississippi, Georgia, any of the southern places where these things are taking place. There are local community grassroots things that are taking place for years. But the power of MLK after the Montgomery bus boycotts in 1954 is that he starts to get national attention, such that when he shows up to the scene to work on top of the local efforts that are already taking place, it brings in national TV. It brings in national attention. And when that happens, now you have the moral force, if you will, to be able to accomplish national legislation. And so that's why when Shuttlesworth and MLK team up, meaning that MLK comes into town, they have planned this out, is working on an infrastructure that was already here in Birmingham. It's not like folks were just sitting around waiting for MLK. They've already been organizing for years. But now MLK brings that additional attention, that national attention, and in that process, now they say, how are we going to do this moral effort? One of the ways, when they encounter the resistance they do, is to involve children in the protests at one of those ways. And that's very common throughout the civil rights movement, to do stuff like that. You see, you go back down the road again, you go to Edmund Pettus Bridge, there are children in that march as well. That is not uncommon to do because that has a certain moral power for what we're talking about. And of course, because they're here in Birmingham in 1963, the Gaston Motel, the reason that's important is because you just brought folks from out of town. MLK and others are coming from out of town. Well, the Gaston Motel, owned by Mr. Gaston, who was a black business person, so this is a black business in the era of Jim Crow, for many years. That area became the staging ground. That area became the headquarters of the campaign. MLK stayed there. They did press conferences from the courtyard there. There was a lot of meetings there, which is part of the reason it later got bombed, of course, because it was the headquarters. So now you see how these sites were fitting together. The motel nearby here, a block away. You have the park here, right, where the confrontations often took place. The church, which was very important even before the bombing, which is part of the reason it was a target for the site. It was one of the places for congregation and meeting and discussion. And of course, eventually gets bombed. So all these pieces to fit together for that district, if you will. That's why Birmingham, you come here, of course, there's all kinds of sites you could see just right here, very close to each other, related.
Certainly, that history brought alive and also inspiring us to make changes for the future, certainly.
It does, absolutely. Now, think about with the little girls in this church. So important is their legacy, that there is a coin, a medal that is put out by the United States Mint, so by the U.S. government, a bronze medal that is put out commemorating them. On one side is exactly that image, the church of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And on the other side is the image of the 4 little girls who got killed inside that church, commemorating that moment. Of all the things that happened in Birmingham that were so significant, that moment, of course, stands out as a key moment that is still remembered today. Because to this day, we have that bronze medal put out by the U.S. Mint in the last few years.
Certainly, and commemorating those moments that shaped us as a country and remembering them and honoring them, certainly. Raffi, so much to see just in this one area. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of the history behind this and how it all fits together. It really helps you envision how this happened, the individual people who were involved, and then the great changes that were made. So thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.